tough act to follow, my dear panelists, but we'll do our best. I think the Minister has actually done us a favour, because in the Department of Foreign Affairs, the spectrum of energy and climate that we work on is extremely wide. It really does go from considerations around climate mitigation and the new green economy and what that means for private sector companies that our embassies are supporting, all the way to that sort of loss and damage, the worst impacts of climate change, and how Ireland supports through our development program and our climate finance the communities that are most affected by climate change. So I was going to have to talk about this spectrum, but actually you've already heard it from the Minister. It is a real diversity of work that we are tasked to do, and I think everybody here knows that it is a whole new world, most climate panels start off by somebody saying the IPCC latest report and so on, but I'm very confident that in this room actually the extent of the challenge is very well known, and so we're really going to focus in this panel on action and on opportunities, very much taking the same spirit as Minister Ryan. What can and what is the Irish government doing along with our partners, be they private sector partners, be they NGO partners, indeed academics, and so on. So I'm gonna kick off, Leo, Clancy, with yourself. And just maybe to mention to colleagues, I think you have Slido, and you've probably been using it already in other panels you've been in today. So please do put any questions and comments you have on Slido, and we'll do our very best to get to them. And I suppose just to mention to the panelists as well, I do have some particular questions for each of you, but feel free obviously to bounce off what Minister Ryan so eloquently laid out in terms of our ambition as well. So Leo, we're all, I mean, you're CEO of Enterprise Ireland, and I'm sure in your world this whole new context is very evident on a day-to-day basis, right? Both from that whole spectrum of reducing emission and reducing emissions, building resilience, and those kind of sustainability challenges, I suppose, for individual companies. So I suppose I suppose my first question for you was how do you see Irish companies responding to the new context that we all find ourselves in, and maybe what are some of the challenges that they're grappling with?
So Sinead, thanks a million. First of all, thanks to you for having me here today, and thanks to your colleagues from around the world. It was great at the break to be able to meet so many people that I interact with over so much of the world. And actually I think, climate change is often, it's nearly always a conversation of challenge. And I think in a challenging time, it's great to be represented well in the world. And I think that I'd just like to credit all of our colleagues gathered here today from around the world, because I meet you in difficult places and very easy places to do business. And the job that you do for Ireland is a real credit to us. And I think that's going to be increasingly important in the context of your question. So climate change, sustainability writ large is both a challenge and an opportunity for companies in Ireland. We have a lot of industry that needs to decarbonise swiftly by 2030. The enterprise sector has been set by government on the Climate Action Plan a target of 35% CO2 reduction by 2030. That's going to be challenging, but is achievable in my view. It's exceedable actually on a good day, so I'm very optimistic about it. But the work has started and needs to continue at pace if companies are going to achieve that. And I think there's lots of economic imperative for that in terms of carbon taxes increasing, but the single biggest reason that companies need to do this, and indeed need to look at themselves across the entire ESG spectrum, is license to continue to trade and do business. We live on a small island in the northwest of Europe. If our economy cannot succeed without showing up in the world and trading with lots of other places. And that's how we have such a thriving economy today. We bring back wealth to this country from all parts of the world. We need to do that more and more sustainably and ethically. And I believe we're fortunate that we do have deep ethics in, again, the people I've met around the world. Ireland wants to show up ethically, and I think showing up sustainably in a low carbon way is going to actually be a pass-fail requirement in license to continue to trade. You know, we're seeing increasing pressure from buyers, both government and private sector all around the world, that the people they buy from must have credible sustainability plans. And I would say the level of credibility required is changing quarter by quarter. So I think that's really good. I think there are challenges, but for the companies that get it right, there's lots of opportunities. Now, I don't want to go on too long. I'm happy to talk on a further question about some of the opportunity areas and where Irish companies are succeeding heavily. But I think for us, if Irish companies get sustainability right and decarbonise their businesses significantly, there's a massive opportunity to continue to do well in an economy that's doing very well to start with.
Yeah, and I suppose you're working with companies, some of whom wouldn't be obviously in the green economy, right? But they're finding that for their, as you say, for that license to trade, whether they're in businesses that, you know, they're not necessarily offshore wind companies and so on, but they do need to do that. Well, I mean, maybe we can go on to that question of opportunities, because I think you see, you know, you deal with a wide spectrum of companies, and this is a very wide area. But I suppose, are there some examples where, you know, you think some of, you know, your client companies are really getting it right and they're able to take advantage of some of the opportunities out there?
Huge number. So I'll pick a couple. A company called Xocean, which operates just on the fringes of Carlingford Lough, and people in the room may be aware of Xocean. It's an Irish firm making remote-controlled marine survey vehicles. So one of the big problems with marine surveying is there's a constrained fleet. There's only so many ships that can do surveys. They're really expensive to operate, and they're generally diesel fueled or fossil fueled. Those are the three constraints. What Xocean is doing is creating mostly electrically powered vehicles with a small backup that are very small. They're about the size of an average estate car, a little bit bigger, and they are incredibly, I don't think James, the CEO, would thank me for saying cheaper to operate, but they're incredibly more efficient to operate because they're unmanned on the sea, and they can be remotely operated by mariners based here in Ireland or elsewhere in Europe. So it's giving a wealth of opportunities, decarbonising the actual fleet itself, allowing a huge amount more surveying to be done at potentially lower cost, and giving mariners the opportunity to be based in their homes or in offices. So that's one example. The guys are doing extremely well as a business. It's a traditional business, so it's taking time, but incredibly high growth business. You take another, and that's directly in the business of decarbonisation. I would say surveying for wind farms, seabed surveys, that's one of their breads and butter, but they have the potential to go on then to maintenance activities around footings for wind turbines and other activities. So great possibilities in a business like that. Picking two others, the business of decarbonisation, actually, of industry. Cool Planet is a company that operates out of Powerscourt, actually. They have one of the most beautiful offices. Norman Crowley's the entrepreneur who owns it. One of the most beautiful offices in Ireland, because their first floor office overlooks the gardens in Powerscourt. They have a software solution that lets companies, big industrial companies, measure their CO2 footprint. And actually they have tools built into the software which suggests the capital improvement projects they might conduct in order to reduce that CO2 footprint. And then they have an engineering arm that will do those projects. So it's a lovely continuum of how you decarbonize industry, and the guys are doing business all over the world. And I'll give you one last example, if I may, which is a completely different one. We have supported a company called Taylor in Waterford. So it's a company founded by a clothing industry professional. She's someone who came from that background, but recognized with fast fashion. And I hadn't known this until I saw the project, so shame on me. Up to a year ago, I hadn't realized that when you buy something from a fast fashion retailer, and again, as a man, I probably wasn't fully exposed to this, but I saw it through my daughters and my wife. You'll typically get 2 or 3 garments in different sizes. I hadn't realized that the 2 you send back go straight to landfill in many cases. And Taylor is both providing a sizing tool that lets the retailers and the individual consumers make sure that the size they order is more and more compatible with what they'll need, and thereby reducing landfill. But the actual reduction of landfill was one of the big motivations for that business. So they're just three examples. I could go on all day, but we're seeing a huge upswing in sustainability-led businesses in Ireland. I'm really optimistic that this sector could be one of the highest growth. Last year in 2022, it was the highest growth job sector, sustainability, and agri-tech, which we might come to in the context of concerns efforts in Africa. I think Ireland has a huge potential through our ag-tech heritage to add a lot to farming economy and the efficiency of nutrition provision in the developing world. So that's a whole nother story.
Yeah, well, we'll get to that for sure. Thanks a million, Leo. And Sean, I don't want to date you now, but I know you spent 30 years in the energy sector. And I think it would be good to zone in a bit on that as well, because I know ESBI, you've worked in sort of more than half the countries in the world, as I understand it, at this stage, and including on renewable energy. So I suppose maybe just first question was kind of to take if you could take a sort of a broad view, what are the trends that you're seeing in the energy sector at the moment, just from your ability to take a step back and look at that?
Yeah, thanks, Sinead. Listen, I'd just like to echo as well what Leo said about the support that we get from the various embassies and consulates around the world. Over the last nearly 50 years now, we've been ESB International has been working. And I suppose over that time, if you go back to the trends, there's been a huge change. I can remember when I started out, it was the dash for gas, and everybody was running around, and Ireland was a leader in that technology. And ESB International spent a lot of time running around sort of different countries, explaining how moving to thermal fossils was a really positive thing, and it was about driving the economy forward. You know, and that's obviously 30 years later, we're at a very different point, and I suppose the real trend is decarbonisation. You know, and the electricity sector is really uniquely positioned, I suppose, to facilitate that. In our ability to decarbonise electricity and then move that towards decarbonising heat, transport and ultimately industry. So I think the trends we're seeing is pushing to that renewable sector. Now on a global basis, it very much depends where you are, what part you are on the curve. Like here, obviously, we're pushing for offshore renewables. We've onshore renewables. We're building battery storage projects. We've always had hydro and pumped hydro, but the technology is continuing to move that way. So you can't go fully renewable without having the storage solution. So we're seeing those technologies emerging now. We were talking beforehand about even you know, being able to use district heating with excess power. So you know, there's a number of emerging technologies which we're following. And the really interesting one is the emergence of hydrogen. And hydrogen can be created by excess offshore wind. And hydrogen is storable, which is one of the real tricks with electricity. So it can be used in a large way for seasonal storage for periods when renewable energy may not be available. So we see it on a global basis, different parts of the world. We're working in the Philippines where there's geothermal is there, a solution of choice. Solar prices are coming down, as the Minister mentioned. So the push is towards decarbonisation. Now, I think in different parts of the world they're stepping towards it at a different pace. Obviously, the oil-based economies are slower to step into it, but they certainly are moving that way. And you know, we work in a number of those regions. We're looking at solar-based distribution at a sort of an industrial site level, working with some clients in that. The other areas where we're really starting to see moving is sort of digitization and moving towards smart. So, you know, if you have the electrical infrastructure in place to supply the electric vehicles or the heat pumps, you know, you need to have it all connected in a smart way that you can optimize the system. So you can turn things off, turn things on. We're rolling out smart meters. So I think Decarbonisation is the topic of the day. We still do have the challenge, as the Minister referred to, of the 750 million people in the world who don't have access to electricity, with 80% of them in sub-Saharan Africa. And that is a challenge for the electricity sector, because obviously electrical connectivity is the main driver for economic development in a lot of cases. So, there still is that particular nut to crack as well. But decarbonisation is definitely the trend.
Yeah, and I suppose, given that ESBI has worked all over the world on this, I mean, what, would you have any kind of advice for Irish companies, say, in as you say, every region has its own specificities, but you work a lot in Africa, you work a lot in Asia. Would you have advice for how Irish companies can take advantage of how the transitions are playing out in various regions?
Well, I suppose it's more of a general overview. And this is something we're spending a lot of time ourselves. It was trying to get know your customer, and understand their drivers. So there's a lot of, as Leo said, a lot of really interesting tech here in Ireland being developed. But it's finding the right location at the right time where the fit is for them. Like we've just come out of Africa. We were running the utility in Liberia for 5 years as we put an executive team in there, and incredibly, go down and visit it, and we brought electricity to 750,000 people who had lost it, having been devastated after the wars and the Ebola outbreak. But the ability for that country to absorb some of the new tech and all that, they're just not at that point yet. We're in there we left behind a management team and systems in that utility so that they can at least try and get themselves to a financially stable position, and hopefully the economy grows. So, in that instance there, you're still looking at an economy driven primarily by aid, as opposed to where we would be working in the Philippines with geothermal companies. And down there, what we were doing for them was digitization. So, one of the largest geothermal utilities in the world, and we came in and we worked with them, upgrading all their systems, all their softwares, so that they could become best in class in what they were trying to do as a utility. So they were just on that part of the journey. So I think the real trick is that, the energy sector is from, as developed as we are here, to people, and I saw it in Africa where they got villages connected for this first time. All they want is a light so that their children can study later into the evening, and a socket so they can charge their mobile phone. They have no concept of what a refrigerator or cooking, anything in charcoal would be. So I think, there's no real one answer to that. It's finding the fit between your own capabilities and what's needed in the marketplace.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, I know Liberia quite well, as do some of the colleagues out here. I think what the Minister was talking about in terms of a sort of an obligation on fossil fuel companies to invest would maybe assist a little bit in what you're talking about there, because aid is not a great way to run an energy system, is it? No. And I think that's one of the things. If there was a more kind of predictable source of finance, and that brings me on to you, Hannah, because I suppose we have the Minister has talked about Ireland's role at COP, and actually the last time I saw you before today was a COP 27, and I know at that time you were looking very much at the kind of international climate policy and linkages to your domestic work on energy policy, and so I just wonder, how are you looking at COP 28? What could Ireland, what are some opportunities, what are some challenges, if you look at thinking of it maybe more at Ireland's role in the global climate policy sphere?
Thanks, Sinead, and it's a real honour to be here and to be here with you all. So I suppose I'd echo what Sean has said, and there's huge opportunities in renewables. So according to the IEA's assessments, the energy transition is really inevitable, and it's actually happening a lot faster than many people realize. So the growth of solar, wind, electrification, heat pumps, and so on is really growing exponentially, and it is a real bright, it's a real cause for hope when we badly need it. And Ireland has kind of really strong form in this. So we're one of the world leaders in terms of the global share of wind energy in a single grid in the world. And that's a big challenge given how small and isolated our grid is. So EirGrid, our operator, is really seen as at the vanguard of integrating large shares of wind, and the plan is to double that by 2030, which is fantastic. And Ireland has form in a lot of other really ambitious and leading climate policy. I'll just name a few kind of at home. So for example, Ireland was the first to divest our strategic investment fund of fossil fuel interests in 2018. That was the first in the world. We've banned oil and gas exploration licenses and fracking, and we know that that's necessary if the world is to meet our climate goals of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And it's very disappointing that other countries are continuing to issue new oil and gas licenses. And most recently, planning permission was denied for a new commercial LNG plant because of government climate policy. And these are all really very progressive and in some ways radical, but also necessary climate policies that I think Ireland can bring to the table at the international level, kind of complementing the fact that Ireland has such form in international negotiations and such high credibility there. But I think, and of course emphasizing that we have loads of opportunities for enterprise, but I think framing the climate challenge just in terms of economic opportunities, we really risk I suppose ignoring the fact that this is really an existential issue. It's not just a sort of an enterprise opportunity. It's what we're doing here is trying to stop a catastrophe as quickly as possible. And where I think there's a big challenge for Ireland and our credibility on the global stage is the fact that we're so far behind in decarbonising. We're coming from a place where we have very high per capita greenhouse gas emissions. And I heard a statistic last year which really shocked me, that basically if everybody in the world had the same per capita emissions as Ireland, the world would have already warmed by 3 degrees, you know. So that is something that I suppose what we need to turn the ship around. And even though we've had form in all these kind of areas like banning oil and gas exploration and so on, Ireland's contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions is really about how we consume and what our economic structures are. And it's actually a lot more challenging to change our economic systems, to ask people to change their day-to-day practices and so on. And that is where, I suppose, this transformative change that we have to get to meet the ambition embodied in the Climate Act. The fact that we've actually legislated for binding carbon budgets to limit our greenhouse gas emissions to a pathway consistent with the Paris Agreement obligations is also world leading, but we're not on track there yet. And I think that if we bring about that sort of transformative domestic action necessary to meet those carbon budgets, we'll be able to, I suppose, show that leadership role again at the international stage. But it won't be easy. And it really challenges some of the practices and the economic systems that we even promote globally. We have to think about, you know, what are the enterprises that we're selling abroad, you know, not just in terms of the clean energy, but what other practices are we promoting abroad. I mean, we all have the shared value, I think, in this room and really in Ireland of being stewards of the planet. We have this really enormous opportunity and this major challenge to turn that around, but it will take a lot of work, and we really are I think, still struggling with that deep transformative change that's going to be disruptive, but necessary.
And I'm going to ask quite a self-interested question now, to be honest. If there was one thing that you could recommend as we go to COP28 that we should focus on, that maybe we're not already focusing on, or we're not focusing on enough, what would spring to mind?
If I can have 2 things.
2 things. Real quick things.
Small question. I suppose it's very hard for me to get away from that focus on domestic decarbonisation, and I think there's this growing consensus that we need to really bring forward net zero dates. You know, the IEA is saying that 1.5 degree scenario, you need advanced economies to cut emissions by 80% by 2035. Europe's Scientific Advisory Council, Climate Advisory Council, has said, I think 90% by 2040. So it's really, we need to plan to deeply decarbonise, not by 2050, but by 2040. But leaving the domestic issue aside, I suppose what we spoke about earlier, Sinead, is looking at Africa again, is if there's one issue that I think can be solved for relatively low investment cost, but with a huge benefit for development, for gender equality, for education, and for the environment, for climate, is the issue of clean cooking access. And we already spoke about electricity access for economic development, and that is so very important. But around 750 million people don't have access to electricity, but far more, around 2.5 billion people don't have access to clean cooking facilities in their homes. So they rely on charcoal, on fuel wood, on scavenged wood, basically, which is effectively Stone Age technology for their daily cooking practices. And it's something that could be solved with relatively little investment. If you look at the damage that does, around 3.7 million people die prematurely every year because of the indoor air pollution that causes. Mainly affects women and children, limits women's ability to engage in enterprise, and limits children's ability to go to school and so on, because of the amount of time that it takes literally to gather the wood and to tend the fire and so on. And this reliance on fuel wood for cooking is also a big driver of deforestation, which obviously drives climate change, and also increases vulnerability to climate impacts. So Fatih Birol, the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, has called upon the EU to, I suppose, promote this at COP for, I think, around €4 billion of investment, which is relatively small relative to the EU's overall overseas development aid budget. And Ireland has real form in this again, and Irish Aid has funded a lot of programs, as you know, in the poorest parts of Africa. I think it would be entirely consistent with Ireland's, I suppose, mission to support the most vulnerable countries, and something that would make a huge difference.
No, and I think our ambassadors out there to Malawi and Ethiopia in particular will probably be smiling, because that's certainly something that they've worked very, very hard on. So thank you, Hannah. A lot of food for thought. Now, David, Africa keeps coming up, and you're now the pièce de résistance. But I think concern. It's not, obviously you don't only work in Africa, but you certainly work in some of the poorest countries in the world, some of the countries most affected by conflict, by natural disasters. And so on top of all of that, I suppose, how are you seeing the impacts of climate change, playing out, and what are concerned staff, reporting back?
Climate change is having a dramatic impact, and it's quite alarming. The Minister very, very kindly set out the situation from the point of view of the most vulnerable, and the way in which the nutritional status of the world is going in the wrong direction at the moment. And that rate of change is very alarming. This year, 366 million people will need humanitarian life-saving aid. Only 4 years ago, that was 166. So it's more than doubled in 4 years. And the reasons are manifold, as the Minister outlined, but a key one is climate. When you bring it down to individuals, you start to see the reality. I was in northern Kenya as part of Horn of Africa last year. The farmers there are pastoralists. They had no rain for 5 rainy seasons. Their sheep and goats, which they existed on, had died. They were surviving on some, I suppose, stipends that Concern was giving, and some nutritional supplements. Very, very difficult situation, and the elders told me, we've never seen it like this before. We've seen droughts, we've never seen this before, and that's what's different. It's different now. And even this year in that region, there were some small rains, and there was a rational question that the pastoralists were asking: is, should we bother restocking? And that's a very, very sad situation when you see an entire community that's been doing that for thousands of years saying, this has just changed, the world has changed beyond us. You'll see other scales as well. If you go to Asia, go to Pakistan last year, there was a flood. 33 million people were displaced by the flood, which I suppose, when you compare it to what we see here, it gives you a sense of the scale of difference. Concern has been working there for 20 years, and we've been doing lots of work with communities to prepare for floods, because they happen annually in that country. But the scale of flooding and the degree of flooding is just unprecedented. It overwhelmed everything we've done. We worked with 1.5 million people to provide them with some cash assistance and supplements over the course of the year. Many of those have lost everything, and we're still needing to provide support to them. And you see the kind of deeper changes. So in Chad, we work in Lake Chad. The lake has become very saline because of the salinity of the soil, because of the degree of heat in the Sahel. And the ground is increasingly unfertile. What's happening there is young people, and young men in particular, are kind of losing hope, and they're starting to join militias, and you're starting to see a spread of conflict, and that's coming across the Sahel. And then you obviously get those who don't get caught. I was in Somalia, in Mogadishu. I visited our health centre there 5 minutes after I arrived. Little child arrived, 5 years old. He was in a very bad state. His upper arm circumference was the same as my finger. A very, very, very serious state of malnutrition. And that's the concern that Concern has, is the situation is deteriorating and it's really getting very, very serious.
And what, I suppose, what are you doing? What do you think we need to be collectively doing more of, I suppose, Concern, but also ourselves in Irish Aid and the development sector?
Well, we get great help, as you know, and thank you to the ambassadors, as you say. Malawi and Ethiopia will be two of the ambassadors we work with. Thank you for their support. It's been really, really great. What we do, I suppose, if you take it at a macro level, and Niamh referred to this, I mean, the average African has a carbon output of about 1 tonne. Europe is 7 times that. America's 10 times that. So yes, there is work that can be done to reduce the carbon footprint in Africa. But for us, it's about adaptation. It's about how do we enable people adapt to this new reality. And Leo talked about agri-tech. And one of those things is to say, in a rural context, how do we introduce what we call climate-smart agriculture? An agriculture which changes the seeds, changes the way we provide nutrients to the soil, changes the way the soil is tilled, seeks to adapt whatever water supplies are there better in terms of boreholes, in terms of solar pumps, that kind of thinking. That requires significant investment, particularly when we look at the scale of need out there. And then you think about the reality that many, many people are going to move from a rural context to urban context. In fact, the figures suggest it's going to move from 40% urban in the countries we work in now to 70% over the next 10 years. So the question for us is, what can we do in an urban context to skill up people to address this? What can we give them in the way of skills? And we have had graduation programs in the likes of Dhaka, I would have seen one in Bangladesh, where we introduced a number of different skills to a group of people living in an informal settlement. Some digital skills, some other skills in terms of the ability to grow little businesses in those economies with small savings and loans institutes, taking advantage of things like trying to take advantage of biogas in those environments. So working there to build little bits of enterprise, and then working also with private enterprise in those countries and local partners to say, okay, what can we do with private enterprise here to improve the situation? In Nairobi, we worked with a small local nutrition firm to create a new kind of snack food, which was very nutritious for use in the urban slums, which has been very successful for them and for improving nutrition in the slums. Similarly, in Bangladesh, we're working to see what we can do to improve the seeds and the supply chains to those areas that are most affected, so that they get a different kind of economic environment in those countries. So you have to think from an economic perspective in terms of the degree of change and the opportunity. And there is opportunity here because you are changing things, but it requires investment. And I suppose the real ask for me is, what can we do as a country to provide more support to these countries? The needs are enormous, the needs are growing. And I hate to say it, but it feels like the aid system is going to be entirely overwhelmed. It's a very worrying situation. We as Ireland need to show leadership. We need to do more. And I think we do, but we have more to do. And the leadership should extend not only to what we ourselves do in terms of managing our own carbon output and managing our own supports to the least developed nations, but also in terms of the diplomatic world and what we can do in that world to emphasize the significance of climate change, to emphasize the responsibility and the injustices that are out there, and the responsibility we in the developed world bear for what is happening in the least developed countries. There is a real role there, and I think Ireland thankfully has always played that role. I think that the kind of values that the Minister expressed and earlier panels expressed reflect those values. It's really important we continue to show them. There's a very difficult road ahead from the point of view of the most vulnerable people in the world.
And somehow, David, you've managed to help us go full circle by both coming back to private enterprise and Leo, but also coming back to the Minister in terms of Ireland's role in climate diplomacy, so well done. We're getting the red numbers now on the timer, which I was quite happy I couldn't find, but then it was pointed out to me, so I can't ignore it. But I do have, I have a few questions, and it would be great if we could get to a couple of them. I'm not sure if I'm just reading them or if people are going around with the mics, but I think maybe because of time, I'll start just reading a couple. One which is very topical, I think, in the context of COP28 is asked by Jerry O'Donovan from our CG in Edinburgh. What are the potential implications to Ireland's climate goals and planning by recent negative revelations around operations of carbon offset schemes? So we know that this is a very hot topic in the lead up to COP28, the whole area of carbon offsetting. Would anybody like to take that one?
I think that's a question for you, Sinead.
No, I can't answer that question. No, go ahead, David.
I mean, we have looked at this in concern to say, what could we do in the way of helping the very poor communities we work with to take advantage of carbon credits? Is it possible to take advantage of them for those communities? And you start to arrive very quickly at an ethical question that says, well, if we work with local communities and create carbon offsets, are we helping them or are we actually hindering them in terms of the way in which those offsets are going to be used? And it does become difficult for us as concerned. We've looked at it ethically and we said, well, if we can make it work so that the offsets are used to essentially enable industry to happen that needs to happen. So maybe the delivery trucks for supermarkets in our city, you might go, well, maybe they need a carbon offset, but perhaps a large fossil fuel organisation does not. Very difficult to manage, a difficult ethical question, and I think it is one that we all struggle with, is how do you use carbon offsets in a way which is actually productive?
We're going to have to wrap it up.
Okay.
So you got the last word, David. I got a capital letters note there because I could certainly talk to you guys all afternoon, and I'm quite sure the audience would agree with me that it's been a whistle stop, but a really fascinating whistle stop into, as the Minister set out, really the broad range of what Ireland is doing and can be doing more of in energy and climate. So thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks so much.